AITA for protecting myself after my wife kept our son from me and told his school I was unsafe. I'm Jonathan, 39. Brooke and I had been married 11 years when this happened, and our son, Miles, was 8. Before all of this, I would have described our marriage as basically solid. Not perfect, but functional. Brooke and I had different instincts as parents, and for years, I actually thought that was good for Miles. I was the parent who cared about bedtime, screen limits, finishing what you started, and consequences that matched what happened. Brooke was better at calming Miles down when he was upset, getting him to talk, and knowing when he needed comfort instead of another lecture. When he was 4, that balance worked. At 8, he had started noticing the gap between us. If I said no to another hour of video games, Miles had learned there was a decent chance Brooke would turn it into 20 more minutes. If I told him dessert was off the table because he had refused dinner, he might wait until I left the kitchen and ask her again. I noticed it happening and mostly let the smaller stuff go. That part is on me. I told myself I was choosing peace. I didn't want every disagreement about bedtime or chores to become a marital debate. Looking back, what Miles learned was that Dad's rules were negotiable if Mom got involved. Brooke had even said a few times, right in front of him, "If Dad says no, come talk to me." I hated that line. I told her so. She would shrug and say, "Sometimes you make decisions before you hear the whole story." Her older sister, Kendra, thought my rules were evidence of something worse. Kendra was 40 and had never liked me much. She had this habit of taking ordinary words and replacing them with loaded ones. A bedtime was control. Limiting sugar was rigidity. Taking away a game for bad behavior was punitive. Brooke talked to Kendra about nearly everything. I didn't mind my wife having a close relationship with her sister. What bothered me was that I would think Brooke and I were in the middle of a disagreement, and suddenly I'd hear Kendra's opinion coming out of Brooke's mouth, as if she were the third vote in our marriage. The argument that blew everything up started with a credit card statement. Months earlier, I had bought Miles a small game add-on through his console. I made the mistake of leaving my card saved to the account. We had a purchase PIN, but Miles had watched me enter it enough times that he apparently figured it out. One evening, I saw several charges I didn't recognize. $19.99, $49.99, $79.99. More smaller charges. The total was $238. I asked Brooke if she had bought anything for him. She hadn't. I went into the console account and saw a series of in-game purchases made over 2 days. Then I checked my email. The purchase confirmations were gone from my inbox. They were still in the trash folder. I called Miles into the living room and asked him if he knew anything about the charges. He stared at the carpet and said no. I asked again. He said, "Maybe the game did it." I said, "Games don't type in a PIN by themselves." That was when he started crying. Eventually, he admitted he had made the purchases. He also admitted deleting the emails because he knew I'd see them. I was angry, but I didn't yell at him. I told him to hand me the controller, and I put it on the top shelf in a hall closet. Then I told him there would be no games for 2 weeks. He had to apologize for taking money without permission and for lying. He had a birthday envelope with cash from grandparents and relatives that Brooke and I kept for him. I wanted a portion of that money to go toward repaying what he had spent, not all of it. I also wanted him to work off part of the rest with extra age-appropriate chores over time. Brooke objected immediately. Not to the gaming ban. Not to the apology. The birthday money. "He's 8, Jonathan," she said. "You're treating this like fraud. I'm treating the lying like lying. You want to take money people gave him for his birthday. I want him to understand that spending someone else's money costs something. He already feels terrible." Miles was sitting on the stairs where he could hear us. I told Brooke we should talk in the kitchen. She followed me in and said my punishment was too severe. I said I was willing to discuss how much of the birthday money we used, but I wasn't willing to pretend the money had appeared from nowhere. That night, after Miles went to bed, Brooke called Kendra. I knew because I heard my name through the wall. About half an hour later, Brooke came back into the bedroom and said, "Kendra thinks taking his birthday money is financial punishment." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I said, "Why is Kendra deciding this? She isn't deciding anything. Then why do I know her opinion before you and I have finished our own conversation?" Brooke crossed her arms. "You always do this." "Do what?" Act like anybody who disagrees with you is interfering. No, I'm saying I married you, not your sister. That turned into another argument. At some point, Brooke brought up something I had done the year before. It was a fair thing to bring up, even though I hated the way it eventually got used. Brooke and I had been arguing at the dining room table about something unrelated to Miles. I got frustrated and slapped my open palm down on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. Miles had been in the hallway. He flinched. The look on his face stopped me cold. I didn't hit anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. But I scared my kid. I apologized to him that night. I told him adults are responsible for how they handle anger too, and that making the room scary wasn't okay. I also apologized to Brooke. I never did it again. During the argument about the game charges, Brooke said, "You don't understand how intense you get." I knew exactly what she was referring to. I said, "If you think I'm getting too worked up right now, I'll go take a walk." She said, "That's not the point." What is the point? The point is Miles shouldn't have to be afraid of making a mistake. Buying $238 worth of game items and deleting the emails isn't a mistake. There, that tone. I lowered my voice. "What do you want me to do, Brooke? I want you to back off." I told her I wouldn't finalize anything about the birthday money that night. I would sleep on it. We could talk the next day. I thought that was the end of it for the evening. The next afternoon, Friday, Brooke told me she wanted to take Miles to Kendra's for the weekend. A reset, she called it. She said everyone was too tense and 2 days apart would be good. I didn't love the idea, but I agreed. I remember standing in our bedroom doorway while Brooke packed. She put more clothes into Miles's backpack and a small duffel than he needed for 2 nights. I said, "That's a lot for a weekend." She said she didn't know what the weather would do and wanted options. It was a weird answer, but not weird enough for me to start a fight over socks. Before they left, Miles asked if he was still grounded. I said yes. The 2 weeks don't disappear because you're staying at Aunt Kendra's. Brooke gave me a look. I ignored it. I hugged Miles and told him I loved him. He hugged me back. Nothing about that moment felt like a child terrified to be around his father. That matters to me now. At the time, I thought I'd see him Sunday. Sunday afternoon, I texted Brooke asking what time they were heading home. No answer. Around 6 o'clock, I called. She picked up on the 4th ring. I could hear a television in the background. I said, "What time are you coming back?" She paused. Then she said, "Miles isn't ready." Ready for what? To come home. I thought I had misheard her. What does that mean? He needs more time. Put him on the phone. Not while you're like this. Like what? Exactly. That answer made me angry in a way I still remember because it felt designed, so there was no possible response that didn't prove her point. I took a few seconds before speaking. "I'm not coming over to fight. I'm asking when my son is coming home." Brooke said, "We'll talk tomorrow." Then she hung up. A few minutes later, Kendra texted me. "Do not make this worse by showing up." I had never told anyone I was showing up. That was my first real indication that a different conversation was happening somewhere else. I didn't go to Kendra's house. I texted Brooke instead. I wrote that I expected a date and time for Miles to come home and that I wanted a private phone call with him that night. She replied almost an hour later. "He does not want to talk right now." I asked, "Did Miles say that, or are you saying it for him?" No answer. The next day, I asked again. Brooke called me and said Miles was not comfortable. That was the first time she used language that made the situation sound less like a parenting dispute and more like something else. I asked what he was uncomfortable about. She said, "You being angry." I said, "I'm allowed to be upset that he spent money and lied. That doesn't mean he loses his father." She said I was proving why they needed space. I told her I wanted us to see a family or parenting counselor immediately. She said it was too soon. I asked for a specific return date. She wouldn't give me one. 2 days became 4. 4 became a week. I called Miles every day, but most of the time Brooke either didn't answer or she sat beside him during the call. When I did get him, he sounded normal at first. He told me what he ate for breakfast. He complained that Kendra's guest room was too bright in the morning. He told me he missed one of his stuffed animals. Then I asked when he thought he was coming home. He looked off screen. Brooke said something I couldn't hear. Miles looked back and said, "Mom says I need space." It didn't sound like him. I said, Do you want space from me? He shrugged. I don't know. Are you scared of me? Brooke cut in immediately. Jonathan, don't interrogate him. I'm asking him a question. You're putting him on the spot. Then she ended the call. That was around the time the phrase, emotionally unsafe, started appearing in her texts. Brooke had never spoken like that during any previous parenting disagreement. She wrote that Miles needed to feel emotionally safe before we could talk about bringing him home. I asked what exactly I had done that made him unsafe. She referenced the time I slapped the table the year before. I wrote back that I had apologized for that, changed my behavior, and had never threatened or harmed either of them. She replied, "You don't get to decide whether someone else feels unsafe." That sentence sounded exactly like Kendra. I still didn't know how involved Kendra really was. I only knew Brooke was talking like her. By the second week, Brooke's mother, Diane, was involved. Diane was 65 and hated conflict so much that she would agree with whoever sounded more upset just to get everyone to lower their voices. She called me one evening. "I think you should give Miles some time." "How much?" "However much he needs." "Did Miles tell you he doesn't want to see me?" A pause. "Brooke said he's having a hard time." "That's not what I asked." "Jonathan, he's a little boy. He shouldn't be in the middle." "I agree, which is why adults should stop speaking for him." She sighed and told me I was making everything harder by pushing. I asked what she thought I should do if a weekend turned into a month. She said, "It hasn't been a month." That answer stayed with me because the implication was that there was some undefined amount of time I was expected to accept before I was allowed to treat this as serious. Grant, Brooke's cousin, reached out around then too. Grant and I had always gotten along. He didn't accuse me of anything. He mostly wanted to know whether there was something legal going on. I said, "Not that I know of." He sounded surprised. He told me some family members were under the impression I wasn't supposed to pick Miles up from school. I asked who told them that. He said he didn't know exactly. He had heard it through Diane. I called Brooke. She didn't answer. I texted her asking whether she had told anyone I was legally restricted from Miles. She responded, "I told people the school is aware of the situation." That was not an answer. At the beginning of the third week, the school called me. The administrator was careful with her wording. She said Brooke had asked staff not to release Miles to me at pickup. I was listed as a parent and an approved pickup contact. There was no custody order in the file. No restraining order. No court restriction. The school needed clarification and documentation if there was a legal reason I wasn't allowed to pick up my own son. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while she explained it and feeling something inside me change. Until then, I had treated everything like an ugly marriage argument. I believed if I stayed calm, explained myself clearly enough, and kept asking for counseling, Brooke would eventually come home and we would sort it out. The school call ended that belief. I said, "There is no restriction that I know of." She asked whether I wanted to update any emergency contact information or make a note that the parents were in disagreement. I said I wanted the record to remain accurate and that I would provide any legal documentation if that changed. Then she mentioned that Miles had spoken to the school counselor. I didn't ask her to tell me confidential details she wasn't allowed to share. I asked whether there was a safety concern I needed to know about as his father. The response was neutral. The counselor wasn't declaring anyone right or wrong. What I was told was that Miles had talked about the game incident and said he didn't want me to still be mad at him. He had asked when he could go back to his room at home. He had said he missed his things. He had not reported that I hit him. He had not reported that I threatened him. He had not said, "I don't want to see my dad." The distinction wrecked me. Not because it proved Brooke was some cartoon villain. It didn't. But because I had spent weeks hearing that my son was afraid to be around me when what he seemed to be afraid of was that I was still angry about the thing he had done. Those were not the same thing. That evening, I texted Brooke. I didn't tell her exactly what the school had told me. I simply asked again for a private call with Miles and asked her to confirm whether Miles had ever personally told her he didn't want to see me. She wrote back, "He has made his feelings very clear." I asked, "What exact words did he use?" She didn't answer. That was when I changed how I handled everything. I stopped calling during arguments. I moved important communication to text and email. I saved the messages where the original plan was clearly described as a weekend. I saved the messages where I asked for private calls with Miles and Brooke refused. I saved Kendra's message telling me not to show up before I had ever threatened to do that. I saved every time Brooke used Miles's feelings as a reason I couldn't see him while refusing to let him speak to me alone. And I made an appointment with a family law attorney. That was not a step I wanted to take. I didn't walk into the office asking how to win custody. I asked what I was supposed to do when my wife had taken our son for a weekend, had kept him away for weeks, and had instructed his school not to release him to me despite there being no court order. The answer was that continuing to improvise was a bad idea. I needed a formal temporary parenting arrangement. I needed to stop relying on verbal promises. I needed to document everything. My attorney also told me something I should have understood sooner. Staying calm didn't mean staying passive. So, I had a proposed parenting schedule sent through the proper channel. It asked for regular parenting time, clear exchanges, school access for both parents, and no interference with reasonable communication between Miles and either parent. I didn't ask to cut Brooke out. I didn't ask to keep Miles from Kendra. I asked for a structure no one could redefine halfway through the week. Brooke exploded. She called me and said, "You got a lawyer?" "Yes." "After I told you Miles needed space? After you told his school I shouldn't be allowed to pick him up? You're proving Kendra right." "About what?" "Everything has to be your way. You always have to force the issue. You told the school I was restricted from my son. You made this bigger than a marriage argument." She said she couldn't believe I had turned a family problem into a legal threat. I said, "I asked you for a return date. I asked you for counseling. I asked you to let me talk to him privately. You said no to all three." She started talking over me. I ended the call and texted that I would only discuss scheduling in writing until we could do it constructively. That made her angrier. It also made everything clearer. By the fourth week, I had another problem to deal with: money. Before this, Brooke and I had shared household expenses normally. While she and Miles were staying with Kendra, I was still sending money the way I always had because I expected them to come home. Then I realized I was effectively funding an open-ended arrangement with no agreed end date while being excluded from parenting decisions. I wasn't going to stop paying for my son. I paid his school costs directly. I paid for his medical copays. I bought the clothes and supplies he needed. When Brooke sent me receipts for things that were actually for Miles, I paid my share. What I stopped doing was sending an unrestricted household amount to Brooke while she lived at Kendra's. Brooke called that financial punishment. She wrote, "You are using money to force me back." I replied, "I'm paying Miles's expenses. I'm not financing an indefinite second household with no parenting agreement." She wrote, "This is exactly what Kendra warned me about." I stared at that sentence for a long time. There was Kendra again. Always already in the conversation. By week 5, Brooke and I were barely speaking except in writing. Miles had started to get more direct with me during supervised calls. Once he asked, "Are you still mad about the game?" I said, "I'm not happy you did it, but I love you, and I'm not sitting here angry at you all day." He looked relieved. Then he asked, "Can I just go to my room when I come home?" I said, "Of course." Brooke interrupted. "We're not talking about that right now." Another time, Miles held up his controller on the video call. The same controller I had put in the closet. I asked how he got it. He said, "Mom brought it." Brooke said, "He needed something normal." I didn't argue in front of him. After the call, I texted her, "So the grounding is over?" She replied, "I'm not continuing a punishment that I never agreed with." That small detail bothered me more than I expected. The entire crisis had supposedly been about how frightened and emotionally overwhelmed Miles was. But at Kendra's house, he had his controller, more gaming time, no repayment plan, and no reason to face the original issue. Of course, an 8-year-old preferred that arrangement. That didn't mean he hated his father. By the end of week 6, a temporary arrangement was finally in place. It was not dramatic. No one came to a house and removed a child. There was no courtroom speech. There was simply enough legal pressure and enough documentation that Brooke could no longer treat my access to Miles as something she personally granted or withheld depending on how she felt. I got consistent time with him again. The first time he came back with me, he was quieter than usual. He put his backpack down, walked to his room, and stood in the doorway. Everything was almost exactly where he had left it. He looked at me and said, "I thought you were going to be really mad." I said, "I was mad about what you did. I'm not mad that you're here." He asked whether he was still in trouble. That was the kind of question an 8-year-old would ask after 6 weeks of adults turning discipline into a family crisis. I told him we weren't going to solve everything in the first hour. Then I asked if he wanted grilled cheese. He did. We ate at the kitchen counter and talked about school. Later that night, he asked if he could sleep with the hallway light on. I said yes. That nearly broke me. Not because I thought it meant he feared me. He had slept with the hallway light on plenty of times after bad dreams. It broke me because I realized I was analyzing every tiny thing my own son did, trying to figure out whether someone would use it as evidence for one version of the story or another. That was not a healthy way for either of us to live. Around the second month, Brooke agreed to parenting counseling. At first, it didn't feel useful. We spent sessions arguing about words. Strict. Controlling. Safe. Punitive. Protective. I admitted what I had done wrong. I said I should never have slapped the table during that argument the year before. I said I had let too many smaller parenting disagreements slide because I confused avoiding conflict with cooperation. I said the birthday money consequence was something I was willing to modify if a counselor thought there was a better way to teach restitution. What I wouldn't accept was the idea that disagreement over discipline justified removing me from my son's life. Brooke kept saying I needed space. I would ask, for 6 weeks. She would say, it got out of control. I would ask how. For a while, she wouldn't answer. Then, in one session around the 3rd month, the counselor asked Brooke to explain exactly how the email to Miles's school had been written. Brooke stared at her hands. She said, Kendra helped me. I already suspected Kendra had influenced the language. I didn't know she had helped write the email. I asked, helped you how? Brooke said she had called Kendra because she didn't know what to say to the school. The counselor asked why she was contacting the school in the first place. Brooke said she was afraid I would pick Miles up without telling her while he was staying with Kendra. I said, I never said I was going to do that. She said, I know. That answer hit harder than if she had argued. Then Brooke explained what Kendra had told her. According to Brooke, Kendra said that if she wrote, my husband and I disagree about discipline and I don't want him picking our son up right now, the school would tell her they couldn't stop me. But if she said Miles felt emotionally unsafe, people would take it seriously. I felt cold. I asked, so whose phrase was that? Brooke said, Kendra suggested it. Did you agree with it? A long pause. At the time, yes. Did you think I was dangerous? I thought you were too angry. That isn't what I asked. She looked at me. No, I didn't think you were going to hurt him. The counselor didn't jump in to declare a winner. She asked Brooke what she believed unsafe meant when she used it. Brooke said she meant that Miles felt pressure and didn't want to deal with me being angry. I said, that is not how everyone else heard it. She whispered, I know. That was the first real crack in the story Brooke had been maintaining. The second came a few sessions later. We were talking about the claim that Miles didn't want to see me. I asked the question I had asked by text weeks earlier. What did he actually say? Brooke said, he said he didn't want you mad at him. I waited. She looked away. I said, and that he didn't want to go back if you were still mad. Did he say, I don't want to see Dad? No. Did he say he was scared to be around me? Not exactly. I felt my jaw tighten. The counselor told me to slow down. I did. Then I said, you turned I don't want Dad mad at me into I'm afraid of Dad. Brooke closed her eyes. I know. There was no dramatic confession after that. No sudden flood of apologies. The truth came out in pieces. Brooke said that after the first weekend, she knew coming home would mean admitting the whole thing had been a mistake. Kendra kept telling her not to cave. Every time I asked for a date, Kendra said I was pressuring her. Every time I asked to speak to Miles privately, Kendra said I was trying to get around Brooke. When I suggested counseling, Kendra said I wanted a professional to validate my rules. When I got a lawyer, Kendra said it proved I was controlling. Brooke admitted that eventually she didn't know how to end the standoff without looking like everything she had done was unnecessary. So she kept going. That was the part one had the hardest time forgiving. Kendra had influence, yes. But Brooke was 37 years old. She was my wife. She was Miles's mother. Kendra didn't take her hand and physically make her send an email to the school. Kendra didn't force her to deny me private calls. Kendra didn't make her tell relatives that Miles didn't want to see me. Brooke chose those things. To her credit, she eventually said that herself. I let her tell me what everything meant, she said in one counseling session. But I still did it. I appreciated the honesty. It didn't restore trust. Around the 4th month, Diane asked if all of us could meet at her house. I almost said no. The last thing I wanted was a family summit. But by then, Grant had heard enough conflicting versions of events that he was openly questioning what had happened, and Diane said she wanted everyone to stop using Miles as a source of information. I agreed on the condition that Miles would not be there. Brooke agreed too. So one Saturday afternoon, I went to Diane's. Brooke was there. Kendra was there. Grant was there. Diane had put out coffee and some food no one really touched. For the first 10 minutes, everyone tried to be polite. Then Kendra started. She said none of this would have happened if I had simply respected Brooke's request for space. I asked, which request? She said, the request not to pressure her. I said, I was told she was taking Miles for a weekend. Kendra said, plans change. Then I was told he didn't want to talk to me. He didn't. I looked at Brooke. She looked down. Kendra kept going. She said I had forced Brooke into legal action. I said, Brooke didn't take legal action. She told the school not to release Miles to me without having a legal restriction. Kendra said, because he was scared. I said, let's do this in order. I didn't pull out a giant folder and slam papers on a table. I just walked through what happened. Friday, Brooke said weekend. Sunday, she didn't come home. Monday, I asked to speak to Miles privately. No. I asked for a return date. No. I suggested counseling. No. Then the language changed from Miles doesn't want you mad to Miles feels unsafe. Then the school was told not to release him to me. Then the school called because there was no order. Then I learned Miles had been telling the counselor he missed home and was worried I was still mad about the game. Then I got legal advice. Then I asked for a formal schedule. Kendra cut in. You're leaving out the fact that Miles was scared of you. Grant, who had barely spoken, looked at Brooke. He said, did Miles actually say he didn't want to see Jonathan? Kendra answered before Brooke could. Of course he did. That's why they stayed with me. Grant kept looking at Brooke. I asked Brooke. Brooke's face changed. Not dramatically. She just looked tired. Kendra said, Brooke, you don't have to let them corner you. Brooke said, Kendra. Kendra kept talking. She said I had spent months manipulating the situation and that everyone was now acting like one badly worded email erased years of my controlling behavior. Grant asked again. Did Miles actually say he didn't want to see his dad? Brooke finally said, no, not in those words. No one gasped. No one clapped. Diane looked down at the table. Grant leaned back in his chair. Kendra immediately said, that's semantics. Brooke shook her head. Kendra said, he was scared. You know he was. Brooke said, he was scared Jonathan was still mad. Same difference. No, Brooke said, it isn't. Kendra turned toward her. You told me he was scared. I said he didn't want to go back while Jonathan was still angry. And I told you what that meant. Brooke's voice got sharper. Stop answering for me. That was the first time in all the years I had known them that I saw Brooke shut Kendra down in front of other people. Kendra looked stunned. Brooke continued. You helped me write the email. I sent it. I agreed with it. That's on me. But stop telling everyone what I meant. Diane asked quietly. You two wrote the school email together? Brooke said yes. Kendra said, because nobody was taking her seriously. I asked, who was not taking her seriously? Kendra said, you. I said, I was asking when my son was coming home. She called that pressure. I said, you told me not to show up before I ever said I was coming. She had no answer for that except to say she knew how I operated. Grant asked, did he ever show up? Brooke said no. Diane looked at me and said, I thought there was some kind of restriction. I said, there wasn't. She looked at Brooke. Brooke said, I asked the school not to let him pick Miles up. I didn't have an order. Diane closed her eyes for a second. Then she said, I should have asked. That was about as much accountability as Diane was capable of in one sitting. Kendra eventually got up and left. She didn't storm out. She just said everyone had decided I was the reasonable one because I had a lawyer and knew how to make myself sound calm. Brooke started to respond, then stopped. She let Kendra leave. The meeting did not repair anything. What it did was remove the last layer of pretending. There was no longer a family-wide story that Miles had clearly rejected me. There was no mysterious legal restriction. There was no ambiguity about who wrote the school email. And Brooke had finally said, in front of her own family, that Kendra did not get to speak for her. A few weeks later, Brooke asked if she could come home. She was no longer staying with Kendra by then. She had found her own place. We met after a counseling session. She said, "I want to try again." I knew she meant the marriage. I asked what try again meant. She said she wanted to move back in, keep counseling, and rebuild. I sat there for a long time. A year earlier, or even during the first week Miles was gone, I would have agreed immediately. By then, I couldn't. I told her, "I'll rebuild a way to parent with you. I'm not promising to rebuild the marriage." She started crying. She asked if I was punishing her. I said no. She said it felt like punishment because she was finally admitting what she did wrong and I was still leaving. I understood why she felt that way. But there is a difference between someone finally telling the truth and the truth erasing what happened before it. I said, "You kept me from our son for 6 weeks. You told people he was afraid of me when that was not what he said. You told his school not to let me pick him up. I don't know how to go back to being your husband after that." She said, "I was scared too." I know. Kendra got in my head. I know. I told you I was wrong. I know. She looked at me and said, "Then what else am I supposed to do?" I did not have an answer that would make her feel better. Some things can be repaired through effort. Some things can be acknowledged without being restored. We kept going to parenting counseling because we had Miles. That part mattered more than whether Brooke and I could still function as a couple. The next several months were not smooth, but they were predictable. And predictable was an improvement. We had a schedule. We both had school access. Neither of us could unilaterally block the other from ordinary contact. We agreed on basic rules between homes, especially around schoolwork, screen time, and money. Not identical rules. Basic ones. Miles had his own counselor for a while too. The goal was not to figure out which parent he liked more. It was to help him stop feeling responsible for adult emotions. He eventually admitted something that should have been obvious from the beginning. He had liked staying at Kendra's. He missed me, but he liked not being grounded. He liked getting his controller back. He liked that no one was asking him to repay anything. He also hated hearing adults argue about whether he was scared. That is how children are. They can miss dad, enjoy getting away from dad's consequence, love mom, feel mad at mom, and want everyone to stop talking, all in the same day. That complexity had been flattened into a story adults could use. Brooke changed too. Not overnight. She still had a reflex to rescue Miles when he was uncomfortable, but she started catching herself. One afternoon, he forgot a homework assignment at my place while staying with her and asked her to drive across town to get it. She called me. I expected the old Brooke to say we needed to fix it for him. Instead, she said, "He says he needs it tonight." I told him he should email his teacher and explain he forgot it. I said I agree. That was it. No Kendra. No argument. No child carrying messages. My relationship with Diane never went back to what it was. Months after the family meeting, she apologized to me privately. She said, "I thought telling you to give everyone time was keeping things from getting worse." I said, "It made it easier for nobody to ask what was actually happening." She nodded. I accepted the apology. I did not pretend the 6 weeks had not happened. Grant and I stayed on decent terms. He never became some heroic ally. He just asked one direct question at the moment everyone else was talking around the truth. Sometimes that is enough. Kendra's role in our lives shrank. Brooke did not cut her off completely. I never asked her to. They were sisters. But Brooke stopped treating her as the first call for every conflict. Kendra was no longer present in parenting discussions through Brooke's texts. She no longer contacted me directly. And after the family meeting, some relatives stopped accepting her interpretation of every disagreement as fact. That was basically her consequence. She lost influence. Not her family, not her job, not her entire life. Just the right to narrate everyone else's. Around 11 months after the weekend that was supposed to last 2 days, Brooke and I finalized the divorce. There was no last-minute reconciliation. There was no revenge speech. We signed what we needed to sign and left separately. I was sad. I had spent 11 years assuming Brooke would be the person beside me when Miles became a teenager, graduated, left home. All of it. Divorce did not make what happened feel like a victory. I got stable time with my son back. I also lost a marriage. Both things were true. The part one had to own was that our parenting problems had not started with the game purchase. For years, I had watched Brooke override small limits and told myself it was not worth a fight. I had let Kendra's role in our marriage grow because calling it out always created another argument. I had believed being the calm person meant waiting until everyone else was ready to be reasonable. That was not maturity. Sometimes it was avoidance. What changed after the divorce was not that Brooke suddenly parented exactly like me. She did not. What changed was that we stopped undermining each other in front of Miles. If one of us disagreed with a consequence, we talked directly. If Miles asked Mom after Dad said no, the answer became, "What did Dad already tell you?" And if he asked me after Brooke said no, I gave him the same response. A while after the divorce was final, we were both at one of Miles's school events. Afterward, we went back to Brooke's place because Miles had some homework to finish before I took him for the night. His old controller was on a shelf near the TV. The same one I had taken away almost a year earlier. The same one Brooke had packed and brought to Kendra's house. Miles finished eating, looked at the controller, and asked, "Can I play tonight?" The old version of us would have answered separately. I would have said no until homework was done. Brooke might have said 10 minutes first. Miles would have watched our faces and figured out which answer had more room in it. This time, I didn't answer right away. I looked at Brooke. She looked at the unfinished worksheet on the table and said, "Homework first." I said, "Then you're good." Miles groaned because he was 8 and homework was still homework. Then he sat back down and picked up his pencil. Brooke went to the kitchen. I gathered his backpack. Nothing about it looked dramatic. That was the point. We could not put the marriage back together. We could not get those 6 weeks back. But Miles no longer had to live between two different versions of the truth just to find out whether he could play a game. If you like the stories, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.